Så. Så. Ska vi se om det går ens överhuvudtaget. Får hyfsad kvalitet för jag läst detta förut. Jo. 12:02. Vi kör en snabb match. Terran är snabba. 5 vinster. Frågan om varför jag inte får igång min andra själv. Fan. Jag fick igång den förut. Ja. Ja, brottas. Ska vi se då. Så, nu funkar det vandringsskärmen. Smösa över dit så. Vi proxiar honom. Här borta. Det blir jättebra. Proxy. Om vi ska ha reapers behöver vi ha snabb gas typ. Och där kommer nog han. Kamefugla. Kamefuka heter han. Bygger en barack här så det inte syns att jag proxyar. Så. Glider han ut, gör vi så. Vi måste fortfarande ha en som följer efter honom. Så han inte gör någon sån här cannon rush här någonstans. Ja, men det är bra att hitta den med en gång. Det trodde du va? Du skulle kunna cannon rusha mig. Men icke som Nicke. Den gubben gick inte jag på då. Det är jag som ska kisa dig. Ja men vad fan. Så attack. Nej. Det verkar som de får finisha då. Bygger en sån här sätt. Så. Bygger en bas där kanske. Ska ha command center eller satellitoris som vissa kallar det. Sån. Där ska marinesen vara. Vi ser vi kanske ska bygga en här så. Nu ligger CPUn på 4%, det är ju inte så jättemycket. Men jag vill ju att grafikkortet ska prestera, inte CPUn. CPUn är kass. Så. Ska vi bygga en bas här sen? Det här har jag sett Maro göra i GSL, det är ju inga problem. Han har byggt en helt jävla svorm där vet du. man smackar upp ett factory så man kan smacka honom. Frågan är om vi behöver 2 till eller jag har inte råd till. Vi får dyka in, men om vi har, det blir 4 stycken. Nu ska vi se vad han har gjort här då. Nice. Gratis probes, tack. Frågan är om vi kan dyka upp här också. Så, tack. Kör vi det. Så, GG. Han trodde han kunde cannon rusha mig, men det kunde han inte. Ska vi se hur vi ligger ladden nu då. Ludden. Fortfarande silver. Terrarna ligger på 6-13. Shit, kamots! Vad är klockan nu? Måste hålla koll på tiden igen. 12:10. Kanske ska ha lite musik. Kanske ska jag fixa så jag får in min Spotify Premium. Nej, vi kör på YouTube. Vi kan kolla på någon fet podcast. Psychology. Det är bra grejer.
Hey, deserving listeners, this is
Deep Drive. Music therapy in military.
Psychology in Seattle.
Hey, deserving listeners. Today we have a special guest, Hannah Bronson, who won our most recent scholarship, $2,500 from Psychology in Seattle. She had submitted her application along with dozens of others, and the Psychology in Seattle team, it was a hard choice, particularly down to like the last 5 or so. But Hannah really stuck out as the clear winner because she is not only a clinician who is helping people through music therapy and general therapy, but she, in her spare time, which a lot of novice therapists don't really have, she has been dedicating herself to changing society and changing systems and integrating programs, particularly into the military, to help people with PTSD and head trauma. And in the application, she described it, and she didn't go into detail, but I knew behind all that effort, or all behind the sort of tagline, was a tremendous amount of effort and worry. And, when you're doing this kind of work, when you're advocating for new programs, particularly with the United States government, you're going to find that there's barriers, there's resistance, and there's questions and uncertainty. You could spend 3 years of your life dedicating yourself to some effort that could just not go anywhere. And so I just really wanted to reward her hard work to try to make the world a better place and have her on the show to talk about it. So welcome to the show, Hannah.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So let's introduce the podcast. This is called the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and professor. Hannah, can you please introduce yourself to podcast land?
Sure. My name is Hannah Bronson, and I'm a board-certified music therapist. I've spent the majority of my professional career working with active duty military populations across the country at different military installations. And currently I'm in Austin, Texas, and I'm in a bit of a transition. I'll be moving into a doctoral program in clinical psychology in a couple of weeks and moving to Denver, Colorado. So a lot of exciting transition things are happening for me.
Right. In addition to your efforts in the past and plans to make tremendous efforts to make the world a better place, in your essay, you talked about how this move is going to be rough on the old bank account. And so the scholarship is intended to help with that.
Incredibly helpful and just easing my anxiety in the best way possible. So thanks again to you and the Psychology in Seattle team and all the podcast listeners and patrons specifically. It's really helping me out. So thanks to them.
Right. It's all the patrons' money. And the last detail that I'll say is that as a happy bonus, you've been a listener for a long time. Is that right?
Yeah, I think I discovered the podcast. It had to have been like early 2013 when I was like fresh out of my internship and driving all across Southern California to different sites and just trying to make use of that time in my car and discovered the podcast and haven't stopped listening since. So it's been really helpful.
Yeah. So tell us about what you've been doing to make it.
Well, like I said, I've been working with military populations since I was an intern after I graduated from my music therapy degree program in 2012. And that was kind of my first encounter with this population. And if you think about what was going on in the world at that time, there were thousands and thousands of service members coming back from combat deployments with injuries, physical injuries, mental injuries, and into a system that didn't have the capacity fully to assist everyone to the best of their ability. So there was really a call to the community to help in whatever way they could. And being a music therapist in the San Diego area at the time, it was really kind of an obvious answer to do what we could to understand the needs of these people. And I had no prior experience working with the military, and there were no music therapists at that time working anywhere with active duty service members. There were certainly a lot of us working in the VA, but there wasn't any kind of research to turn to or even resources that would direct us in how to best construct programming. And so from that early stage, it was a lot of learning and developing and kind of finding out what the best way to serve the military would be and growing from there. And I'm excited to say now that 7 years later, there's a whole team of music therapists across the country who are starting new programs, and we're learning a lot through research and developing best practices and just refining what we do. So it's been an exciting journey to be a pioneer and just see this field answer the call to a really important population that means a lot to me, and I know a lot of other communities and just civilians as well.
So a lot of this is due to you and your colleagues spending the time doing research, getting it published, and lobbying decision makers to integrate music therapy into the offerings for active duty service members. Do I have that right?
Yeah.
So tell us about that, because I've never done anything like that. I've never had to convince the government to allow me to insert something brand new. You know, because music therapy, for some, they're like, so what? You just sit around in a circle and bang on drums like that? That's not real therapy. It has a similar kind of stigma or misunderstanding as art therapy or drama therapy. And so how did you do that?
Oh, man, lots of blood, sweat, and tears is the short answer. But really, I think in the early stages, it's kind of funny to think back and reflect on it now, because now we have such incredible support from congressional funding and from the DoD actually creating positions, federal positions for creative arts therapists, for art and music therapists specifically, which is just groundbreaking. That's really a sign that a system is changing, is when they want to instill something permanently for continuity and sustainability purposes. But I'm thinking back to like the early days. I was working for a nonprofit called Resounding Joy in San Diego, and they had grant funding from various sources, such as Wounded Warrior Project and specific military organizations. And so we would kind of find an advocate on post or in the community or even in local government that was a champion and had a voice that would get behind what we were doing and really believed in it, when, you know, a good majority, like you said, of the people who we would show up on base with a car full of drums or guitars or instruments, and people would, you know, kind of look at us sideways and say, okay, well, like, where do you fit into this picture? So I think a lot of it in the beginning was just believe by seeing the impact that music had on service members in their recovery, and having them really tell that story, and then just
Så
really
gav de mig lite
creative ways
offersystem.
of
Där har vi
finding
ett gäng
spaces
som bara
that would
står.
allow us to, offer our services. So I remember thinking back
Där är en
to
också.
2012 or 2013. We were working in the Wounded Warrior Battalion on Camp Pendleton in San Diego, and I would show up at formation at like 7:30 in the morning with Dunkin' Donuts and say, "Hey, I'm a music therapist, and I have this program. Whoever wants to come and check it out." Because at that time, it was hard to get referrals from clinicians who just didn't understand exactly who we were, what we did, and then really the service members were the ones saying like, "Hey, we want more of this. This is helpful to us."
So what do you do exactly to help these folks?
Moo.
So it looks differently. I'm going to talk specifically about military, but music therapy in general looks a lot of different ways based on the population
Pjong, pjong.
that you work with. And just a quick definition of music therapy is that it's the use of music within a therapeutic relationship as the agent of change with your patient or your client. And that's to improve functioning across different domains. It could be cognitive, emotional, social, spiritual even. And in the case of the people that I work with who have oftentimes a combination of different diagnoses and that interact and create a really complex presentation. So you mentioned post-traumatic stress disorder, maybe multiple concussions or traumatic brain injuries, and then maybe chronic pain or other physical injuries on top of that. So a lot of those symptoms are interconnected and interlinked, and just can create really a lot of suffering for the people that have them. And music works in amazing ways. And I think two of the most important ways that music works, number one is it functions in the brain differently than most other activities that we engage in. I like to think of it as kind of a full body workout for your brain. So it's engaging multiple regions simultaneously and creating opportunity for rebuilding neural connections, rehabilitating speech, language, motor functions, cognition. But then in addition to that, music moves us emotionally and can connect us to ourselves and other people in ways that sometimes don't necessarily happen just with spoken language or having a conversation. We can all think about times when we've heard a song that reminds us of a specific event or moves us to tears and we don't fully understand why. So it can be a really powerful tool to kind of address these different areas of functioning and help people access healing in a different way.
Yeah, so it sounds like on some level, for some people, there's an unspoken benefit to the work that you do with them, that it helps to, as you say, to utilize all their, different parts of their brain. And if they are suffering from, people, so I can imagine, you can tell me if this is what happens. People, they go to active duty, overseas, and they experience some kind of trauma, and the trauma can be classic, like literally seeing someone die right in front of you, or even having to kill people is actually traumatic a lot for people, or shooting at people, being shot at. Also, just the ongoing terror of, is this the day that my Jeep gets blown up? Or is this the day that a mortar comes, into my room or something? And there's this, even if you never see any actual firefighting, there's this worry every day, and that's very real, and that can be traumatizing too. So they have this extreme, traumatic, fear-based, survival-based experience that does something to people's brains. If you do it for a prolonged period of time, they come back to the United States and they're still in that heightened arousal state, even when they're quote unquote relaxing, and their body is either suffering from actual PTSD or just general trauma and anxiety and disconnection from other people, maybe even disconnected from their bodies, because that's one of the ways that humans cope with trauma is to cut themselves off from their bodies. It actually really works, but of course it has downsides to it. And of course, these individuals, many of them have been traumatized before they even entered the military. So
Yeah.
those kinds of things get triggered. And then they're, back to the United States, and they still are suffering ongoing. They might be drinking a lot. They might be using drugs a lot to self-medicate. They might be disconnected. They might feel disconnected from other people. They might be depressed. They obviously might be anxious. And am I painting a picture of this sort of folks?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And I think you mentioned a couple really important things, like the prolonged exposure to stress, and then add on top of that, compounded trauma, complicated grief, these small concussions or brain injuries that may happen over time that they don't have time to recover from, or maybe don't even get diagnosed or documented. So that, like, the environment in the brain that happens over sometimes decades for some people feels really normalized for a lot of them, which also creates a really hard barrier to seeking treatment too.
So they have brain injuries from explosions, or from what kind of stuff?
Yeah, so if you think about the recent warfare I'm talking about Iraq and Afghanistan, the tactics that have been used primarily are IEDs, or improvised explosive devices, which there's sort of two parts to this. There's the potential trauma, emotional trauma that comes from that unpredictability that I think you mentioned, of like, when are we going to get mortared? Like, is our convoy going to roll over this explosive device? But then also the blast exposure that sometimes can not physically impact someone on the outside, but we like to call it the invisible wounds of these consistent blast exposures that have a severe impact on the brain over time. And if you think about the recommendations for concussion, where you're supposed to take 2 weeks off and not overly stress yourself out and avoid any screens and stop going to work, that just doesn't happen in a combat situation. So the brain doesn't have time to recover.
And so when you're working with them through music, the research shows what sort of thing?
So there's a lot of exciting groundwork laid on exploring how music impacts the brain, and we're scratching the surface on understanding it, and I think that's sort of how it is in general in neuroscience. And I wish I was an expert specifically on all of the intricate workings of music in the brain, but there are some great studies out there that early on showed us that when comparing the brains of musicians to non-musicians, specifically, I think vocalists, that there's a specific track of fibers called the arcuate fasciculus, which is a really fun word to say, that is noticeably larger in musicians. So exposure to musical training strengthens this pathway between, I think, the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area of expressive and receptive language. So what that implies is that even if that person is not trained in music therapy, we can expose them to a period of music learning and improve speech function. So this is most often in our field used with people who are recovering from stroke or any kind of other acute brain injury or illness. And there's great implications for concussion as well that we hope to better understand through more research.
So the idea is that by either activating this already somewhat robust pathway in the brain or building it up, it helps it improves brain function, which might improve one's mood and increase one's ability to cope with life. Is that the thought?
Yeah, that's definitely a part of it. And if you think about music too, and we say the term drugs, sex, and rock and roll, all of these things that activate the pleasure and the reward system in the brain, it's a very real thing. Like, our brains are activating and releasing dopamine, and in a brain that needs recovery or rehabilitation, the dopamine is actually really helpful in improving function. So if you feel good during therapy, if you feel good throughout your day and your mood is improved, then you're going to get better faster. And that's sort of the core of the why.
Do you give people an idea of specifically what it looks like? Because I imagine some people out there are just thinking like, I don't understand. What do you mean by using music? Like, paint a picture for people.
Yeah. It can look like a lot of different things, and I'm talking a lot about the technical part of cognition. And there's a lot of music therapists out there that practice a brand of music therapy called neurologic music therapy that's really based in that. I feel a little bit more integrated in my approach, and a typical session might look like us playing instruments together. So I'll sit down with a person who wants to learn guitar, maybe used to play guitar before they were in the military, and we're using that as a therapeutic tool. So there's the active adaptively learning that is great for cognition and all those great things going on in the brain that we mentioned, but then also kind of the relational aspect of interpersonally creating something with another person. Maybe it's selecting a song that has some deep significance to them, whether it's a fallen battle buddy or a song that expresses some piece of what they're going through. Or maybe we're going to write a song together that they're actually putting their words and their experiences into musical format as a tool for just processing and expressing, and then maybe even sharing that with friends or family. So there can be lots of different layers to that. And I work with individuals, but also do a lot of work in groups. And what I love about working in groups is that music is naturally a social, and it's an opportunity for social engagement. If you think historically, music's always been something that cultures across history have done to bring people together. And so for someone with trauma who might tend to isolate or avoid social situations, it's a really natural motivator and way to engage without having to sit and talk. So it feels a lot more accessible and enjoyable. And whether that's playing instruments, talking about music, listening to music, creating maybe even just a soundtrack of songs that have some relation to your life or personal significance. Or sometimes we do lyric analysis, which is picking a song that we sit down either in a group or individual, listen to the song and analyze what the artist is trying to say, either verbally through their lyrical content or non-verbally, and kind of opens a dialogue for discussion on whatever thematic content comes up.
So in those situations, do you know the clients pretty well, or might this be the one and only time you meet these people?
So it depends really on the setting. I'll talk about the clinic I've most recently worked in. We kind of have two layers. We have an outpatient clinic where I get referrals sent to me, and I maybe will work with that person over the span of 8 weeks. So I'm doing, a typical assessment and then building a treatment plan. And then in the group situation, we have a 6-week intensive outpatient program where they're receiving treatment for specifically trauma in the form of cognitive processing therapy. So writing a trauma narrative and reading it in a group format. And so I a lot of times I'm meeting them on day one, and then by the end of the 6 weeks, we have written a song together as a group and are performing it for their family. So it's kind of an intensive way to, deliver music therapy in a group like that. But yeah, it can look a lot of different ways. In hospital settings, music therapists sometimes will see a patient for one encounter, and then that's it. You've got that 1 hour to to assess, to treat, and terminate. So it can be really brief, or it can be more long-term.
Do you ever get people who say, I'm not musical?
Oh, every day. I would say that's like the number one. Even people who have played music before, there's sort of this cultural belief that musicians it's like you either are or you aren't. And the whole culture of, America's Got Talent and American Idol has, not done much to help this. But